Evening, guys. How you doing? This is episode 8, our Talk GP. We've had some good runs. We've had quite a busy week as well. Had a good time this morning on the Soundcraft Facebook page, just doing some basics in terms of some soldering and just sharing my opinions and all that. That was nice. We had a good response of that as well. Some good discussions. We had a really good interactive session on Monday night, talking about broadcast audio. Where I was talking specifically about my approach from the creative side, my mixer workflows, things like that. If you missed that, please go check out that episode on our Facebook page. And then in that episode, I started speaking. I referred to and spoke a little bit about loudness and how that relates to what we do in the live broadcast environment, specifically from a live event perspective, and explained from my perspective the interaction when it comes to, as an engineer, knowing the chain of events, getting involved in lineups and all that kind of stuff. So then I showed you guys a couple of little basics on R128 and neg23 and a bunch of stuff like that. I didn't really get very technical on the loudness stuff because I mentioned that we're going to get Tinus on board. So I've actually got Tinus here. There we go. Hello, Tinus. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening.
He's sitting in the bush. You can hear the crickets. We're all very jealous. We're stuck in home. I'm sitting in my workshop and you're sitting in the bush.
Hyena, jackal, and if we're very lucky, some leopard as well.
That's cool. So for those of you that know Tinus, I made a comment about 5 minutes ago that that picture that we were showing in the intro is actually exactly like he looks now. Same cap, same beard, same everything. He runs SFX. How long has that been going? How long has SFX been running as a post-production or
21 years.
Company? 21 years. Okay.
Yep.
It's quite an achievement in this industry. Very well done. And then obviously over the years, developing his skill in post-production and all that, he's become very active. He's on the big council with Sakya, broadcast council. But also from an education perspective, very involved in teaching, doing lectures for us at Academy Sound Engineering with corporates, and basically a very high-level expert when it comes to loudness and the signal flows and how that relates to what we do, either from a post-production deliverable or from a live perspective, and the entire signal chain. So one of the things that I've asked him to share with us tonight is exactly that signal chain. We spoke on Monday in terms of, we're on site, we're sitting in an OB van. Most of us know how that works. We do splits, we do MIDI split. I mix, I send the thing to the van, to the broadcast van that's next to me. And then from there, there's quite a few steps before it gets to the end user. And depending on what channel you're on, depending on content, there's a whole bunch of variances that can take place, as well as potential pitfalls if not paid attention to, as well as we'd like to call it sabotage, but it's not sabotage, it's ignorance. If you're not aware of something and you're not paying attention to something, you're shooting yourself in the foot. You can't go after the fact and blame someone because they didn't check this. We coming in live broadcast is, percentage wise, outside of sport, how many live broadcasts would you say we do in this country to public? So not corporate, but it's a very small percentage. If you take about the playlist that is on multi-choice or on SAPC, from a music show perspective, we have one a month maybe. So that's way outside the norm in terms of what the technicians experience on a day-to-day life. And when I say talking about technicians, I'm talking about the guys in final control, the technicians in main control, ICR, all that. So I think before I bumble too much, I'm going to go ask Tinus just to share. We're going to open for questions and answers, and we're going to try and get through a lot till then. So I asked him a question, which I want him to answer now, and then he's going to rabbit trail in a gazillion directions, because that's what we do. But when the audio leaves my van, so we're coming a little bit back to site. So let's take something like Idols or Voice or Salmos or something like that, where there's a broadcaster's van, OB van, as we all know it, where the camera control is, and there's an audio engineer in there, someone like Paul Smith, that's an audio guarantee, or Ari Krier, or one of those guys. I'm doing music, I'm following the rules. In other words, I'm mixing to R128. Don't laugh at me, I try my best. And then we follow the rules, we do our job perfectly. What then? What is the What happens to that signal?
All right, yeah, so the dreaded signal chain. This is also the thing at the end of the day that's responsible for the variances that we hear between what we actually did or recorded, and this counts for post as well, and what eventually makes it to air. I think OBs are most affected by this because of the way the chain works. So in sort of a generic term, each broadcaster has their own sort of signal flows for this. So if you look at local broadcasters, SABC, ETV, DSTV, they all have slightly different routes that they follow. And the same then for internationals. But there is sort of a basic principle, and I'm going to cover that for the most part. So when you're out on location, signal leaving the van goes to a unit just often parked right next to the OB van, where we have some form of encoding taking place. And in many cases, we then refer to sending the signal up to the bird. That's basically your signal going up to satellite. In the absence of satellite, we often use optic. So that's a ground-based link.
Or even ISDN.
And in many cases, or even ISDN, there is situations where that's most definitely still used. In fact, in some of the cases these days, we do cellular connections, where the guys have got very fancy gear that links up several SIM cards.
And
that gives you the necessary bandwidth. So there's various ways of getting that done, but you will often find, especially with critical broadcast, there's more than one of those solutions put in place at a time. We'll look at the satellite scenario for a start. So your signal gets sent via satellite from your location up to the bird and then back down. That downlink then goes to the broadcaster. The broadcaster receives that signal into an ICR, which is the sort of international control room where external signals come together. Most broadcasters, even international, have the same principle. This is where signals get in from all over, not just your broadcast. There's very often lots of other signals that are coming in at the very same time yours is busy happening. Especially channels that deal with news and things like that. There's a lot of feeds coming in all at the same time. So if you ever walk into an ICR or an MCR, you will find it's a very busy place. There's lots of people doing lots of things all at the same time. And very often the person handling your link is actually dealing with 2 or 3 other links, possibly at the same time or in quick succession. Once that link has come in, that's your first point of contact. We'll talk about lineups and things like that in a moment. But from there, typically, your signal will go to an FCC. From the FCC, it then goes for broadcast. In many cases, we refer to that then as your head end. That's where your final encoding on a digital broadcast happens. And from the head end, if we take a satellite distribution scenario again, the signal gets sent up to a satellite for dissemination back down to planet Earth for the rest of us to consume. Or if it's terrestrial, from that point, it gets sent to all the hops and links that we have in terms of a terrestrial network, from where it gets disseminated to the home. At that head end portion, before it goes to satellite or the terrestrial, that's where your final encoding happens. So let's go back to the OB-van. Just to give you an example, we may start with your typical AES PCM audio, which is your sort of wave. If you think of a wave file that we typically use in DAWs, Pro Tools, things like that, 48 kilohertz 24-bit WAV file. That's our sort of go-to standard for stereo. That runs in a pair. That file makes its way all the way through the chain that we've just described until it gets to the head end. At that point, it gets encoded into whatever the broadcaster then uses as their dissemination format, typically something like, let's say, AC3. It would then be an AC3 2.0. It reduces the bit rate so that when they do that final carry of the signal, it's not a very big file. It's definitely not as big as the original PCM audio that we were sending between the OB, ICR, FCC, the entire chain that we've been following. That signal is what gets to home. Now, all things being equal and everything being done fine, the only difference that you should perceive, if that chain was clean, is the bitrate reduction that took place when they did that scrunching of the audio for the final broadcast. But each of those points that I've mentioned up to this point is a potential point of failure.
So I was going to come in with a question. Now that you've mentioned all those points, it's worthwhile mentioning that every one of those points, from leaving the OB van, going even to the OB van, to the main van, my music van to the OB van, is already a potential point of failure in terms of connection, in terms of phasing, in terms of left-right orientation. So how does that go through? Because you're talking about an uplink, a downlink, and a transfer, but that's not just all happening by accident.
No, indeed not. So there is a couple of things that's changed in the latter years. These days we're working digital. That gives us a few advantages. If you do happen to work with analog, there's a few more challenges that you may have to deal with. But I'm going to set analog aside for the moment. The lovely thing with digital is AES works in pairs. So what is very important is that we just identify the pairs correctly. However, these pairs can get swapped at any point in that chain. And this is usually, this usually happens in terms of soft patching or anywhere where this chain gets split and does not get carried on one cable. So if you're familiar with AES, you'll know that it's a single cable that carries your left-right signal as a pair. So if you sent it off correctly and your left is left and your right is right and you didn't get your panning cocked up on the desk, it should make its way through fine. And this is an argument I hear a lot from people that go, but it's digital. Why are we trying to do lineups and checks? And the problem is, somewhere along that incredible chain that we've just described, somebody may have done something that caused that to flip or to flop.
So can I make a comment?
ICR, for instance.
Yeah, so can I make a comment?
Yes.
Here? So you talked about all those international signals coming in. So when we come in on a bandwidth off of a satellite, we're obviously now, your production company, your producers pay for that bandwidth. It's part of your production cost. But that same bandwidth yesterday was used for something else that could have had a misalignment on it or something. So the technician, when he receives that signal, is checking phasing, he's checking all these kind of things, and he fixes, because he had a bit more time, maybe not much else was happening, and he fixes that stream coming in. Tomorrow when we occupy that space, unless he realigns, we now are going through that fix of a previous. I always talk about an unflushed toilet. You've got to flush it and start from scratch. Otherwise, it can get very dirty.
Indeed. So I was actually going to get to that. So what typically happens is one of the classic corrections that they do is time alignment. So you have a delay on the line. Very, very often because of processing, you find that video will lag audio. And they end up having to put a delay on those lines as they come in. You're the next one in line. They tend to fix a lot of the other things, but they very often forget to take out the delay. This is actually something I was going to talk about a little bit later, but and this is one of the things we need to check is sync, besides the left-right issue. But if something came in and they realized there was a left-right alignment issue in terms of balancing the left and right signals, or even flipping them, or a phasing issue, they would have made a correction. Unfortunately, we get the scenario where between two changes of links, you have a change of crew. So the guys that were responsible for the initial link, it's not the same guys that's now handling yours. So they may not be entirely familiar with what just went down in terms of how the settings were done. And just very quickly, repatches, look at the basic stuff. Now, there are some fairly obvious clicks and knobs. But the interesting thing today is, in the olden days, we used to have a scenario where, especially analog, you had what we would call black box technology. Everything had a knob. Everything had a dial. A specific dial was dedicated to something. In the digital age, you now deal with what is generally termed a GUI, which is your user interface. And depending on a profile or whatever may be selected, you could have this thing look different for different people, or at different times, or whatever menu you may have selected when you entered the software. So the stuff that you are looking for is not necessarily always right at hand or where you expect to see them. And some things are hidden in a menu's sub-menu somewhere. So some of the repairs and fixes, especially things like phase inversion, ends up not in a very obvious place. And until stuff appears right or wrong, do people actually go into those settings to try and change them. The most or the classic one to go wrong is the delay. But trust me, all of those others can happen. Left, right being swapped, phase being inverted, or balance being adjusted ever so slightly by dB2 or 3 between the left and the right to have corrected for a previous signal that's come in. So absolutely. That is why it's so important that one of the first things we do once we've established our first connection with ICR is to do a level check. Now, we typically, especially in South Africa, we use neg 18 as our tone reference. If you use something like an EBU tone, you've got your left leg broken. It automatically breaks in the tone itself. If not, you will manually have to break left and right so that FCC can tell which is left and which is right. And that is very important. So once your level is checked, and you've got your left and right sorted, that same process actually needs to be checked past ICR onto whatever is the next step, typically FCC. The next step after that, we can't really check. That's the step that goes to broadcast, but you should check that as well. And how do we check that? We definitely can't do that with tone or anything, but it does mean that first bit of your show that hits the air, typically your opening logo, you should be checking your off air the moment that comes back to see if you can hear any anomalies, especially then phasing or alignment issues.
I was actually mentioning the other night. I was mentioning the other night, I tend to grab that off air of the channel we're going to be on about an hour before.
And have it on a monitor
feed. It on a monitor feed, and have it on a channel that's buried, that's not routed anywhere, with the loudness meter on it. So I'm accomplishing a couple of things. I can go check it, but I can also, I'm building a history file on loudness of where the channel is at over a time period, so I sort of know where I'm going to come in at as well. Or should.
Indeed. And at least for that first couple of seconds, because it's not a very easy signal to monitor once you're really deep into the show, because your delays on those can be, on average, about 2.5, 3 seconds. But I've worked on shows where that delay can run into 5, 6, 7, 8 seconds. Well, trust me, even 3 seconds is quite difficult to monitor if you're trying to do that while you're running a live show. But you should periodically check. I typically do that in and out of ad breaks, stuff like that, while I'm live on air. But prior to actually getting live, we're going to check everything right up to the point where we know that's what's being delivered to the head end, making sure that there were no corrections made accidentally or on purpose, obviously, but for a previous fault that weren't ours. Then we get to 5.1, which can be even more tricky. But in some ways, if 5.1 is done right, it's actually simpler in that we use Dolby E typically to drive the 5.1 signal from OB to broadcast. And there's a very interesting thing that happens with Dolby's Dolby E. They have designed the technology in such a way that that Dolby E signal will run from your OB van all the way to the head end, where the only other conversion that should happen to that signal is the Dolby E into AC3 5.1. There's a lot that can go wrong with that signal along the line, but nothing that you have any control over. That's stuff that they should be figuring out at the broadcaster. It's typically, again, alignment sort of stuff. This signal is so delicate. It's very robust, make no mistake, but delicate in the sense that if you make a volume adjustment on the actual carrier signal, you destroy the signal. Because of the way the signal is constructed, that gets a little bit more technical with metadata and things like that. In digital, a volume change is an algorithmic construction. So if you change volume by even 0.1 of a decibel, you're changing the maths, you're changing the binary code that's being sent down the chain.
So, and just to clarify, you're not talking about what the source that we're creating, you're talking about the link going through. So at ICR and all that.
Correct.
Yes.
So you can mix all you have to and need to and want to. The moment you stick that signal into your Dolby E box and that Dolby E signal is created.
And it
from
writes
that point
metadata.
On, correct. From that point on, no volume adjustment must be made on that signal at all. I'll give you a simple example of something that happened years ago, and we'll stay away from names and places, but we were struggling to understand why a specific Dolby E signal did not survive throughout a broadcast chain. Because when we did tests at the beginning and the end, we got a zero sum. In other words, there were no gain changes. But understanding the signal, we realized somewhere along the line there had to be one. So we started tracing the signal just to find, like halfway down this, two distribution amplifiers that A, dropped the signal, and B, raised it again in two separate stages, so that the net result that you got to see did not suggest the gain change, but there were actually two down the line, one down and one back up to stick it where it was. And that obviously was enough to destroy the signal. So that's what we're referring to.
So when you say destroy signal, what is the impact to the listener?
Oh boy. Okay. So when Dolby E dies, you basically get noise. It's digital noise. It translates into sort of a white noise, if you will. Depending on the system that's being used to do the reproduction, some of the modern ones today detect the noise and actually mute the system, so you thankfully get no audio. Under other conditions, you can get an incredible amount of noise, because what basically happens with that signals at running full scale. So it is as loud as the digital signal can go. So if that hits, a system and it doesn't register it as not functional and it tries to reproduce that sound, you basically get garbage out at full volume. Most systems these days mitigate that. We won't see that happening, but some of the older systems can catch you, or especially along the chain. If you're trying to tap into a Dolby E signal and monitor it to find out what is there, there's a little surprise waiting for you as you hit the monitor button.
Yeah.
But in many cases, and that's why we do all the checks up front, because if we, from ICR and FCC and all these places, they'll hit those monitor buttons. If they get the audio, things are fine. And here's the interesting part: if the Dolby E signal is intact, left, right, center, all those will run down the chain the way you laid it. So you've got to make sure that you've got your channel orientation done correctly. In that particular instance, ICR, for instance, will advise if you've got the channel order wrong, that's not them. They can't change that.
Yeah.
Whereas
Will you
with
just
our
define
left-right
what do you
scenario
mean by channel order? Just define that quickly.
All right. So when you set up your Dolby E encode, you basically tell the encoder, or you feed into the encoder, channel left, channel right, channel center, based on your inputs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 and 8 is typically a stereo feed, and your first 6 being
or down mix.
5.1. Well, it's either if you want to use 7 and 8, where we go for the full channel width of Dolby E, then you would actually do a down mix of your own, or a sub mix, a bus mix into 5.1. Or in some cases, we only use 6 channels for Dolby E, which gives us a little bit more to play with in terms of bandwidth. And then the broadcaster can do the down mix. In South Africa, however, we tend to do the 5.1 plus stereo. So the 7 and 8 is a stereo pair.
So just to quickly, that allocation of left, right, center, LFE, left, rear, right, rear, what is the standard there in terms of that?
So,
yeah, you know why I'm asking.
So yes, indeed. So there are various standards. That's the problem. So we've got the SMPTE standard, we've got the film standard, we've got a whole bunch of standards, and each broadcaster can adopt any one they prefer. But the typical is, for instance, to give you an idea, channel 1 and 2 being left and right, 3 and 4 being center and LFE, and then 5 and 6 being left surround, right surround. Then you get a variation on that will give you channel 1 as left, channel 2 as center, channel 3 as right, 4 and 5 as left surround, right surround, and channel 6 as LFE. And then yet another variation which gives you left, right as 1 and 2, left surround, right surround as 3 and 4, and then center and LFE as 5 and 6. So it's very important that you check with a broadcaster which are the standards they are using.
So just to clarify
that,
I want to just add in my words there. So if you don't ask the question and you go and do your own research and they say left, right, center, LFE, left, right surround, but you're sending it to a broadcaster who's gone left, center, right, the metadata is not going to fix it for you. You're basically going to be sending sound to the wrong speakers in the room on the receiver side.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Because remember what I said earlier, the unique thing about Dolby E is it goes from your van straight to the head end. At the head end, Dolby E gets converted into AC3. That's what's going straight to the home decoder. Now, the home decoder is based on whatever the broadcaster standards are. And they could be different from one broadcaster to the other. The SMPTE standard is quite popular, but I've delivered, we do OBs to a variety of broadcasters around the globe on occasion. And we've even had scenarios where you end up sending surround feeds to different broadcasters that need different variations thereof. In a case like that, you've got to use multiple encoders, correct, to get the job done. You can't say, well, here's a Dolby E feed.
Fix it yourself.
Let me split that to all of you. Now, there are ways to do that, by the way, but that requires them to step down the Dolby E feed, split it into channels, and then re-encode. But
Yeah.
now there's a big problem with that, something that people are not aware of. The Dolby E encode-decode process requires one frame to do the processing. And the Dolby has fixed it to one frame so that we can manage that delay. So if I do an encode, there's a one frame delay. If I do a decode, there's another frame delay. If I do a re-encode, there's another frame delay. All of a sudden, I'm sitting with 3 frames. Whereas by default, if I just do the encode and it goes through the entire processing out the other end, there's only one frame to contend with. And typically, if I look at most vision mixers these days, with the effects and stuff they do, there's almost by default a one frame delay for them in relation to audio. So in that particular case, bang, problem solved by just doing the Dolby E encoding. If we have a scenario where the video's got a 4 frame delay, I have to factor in the 1 frame for my Dolby E, which means I need to delay the audio further by another 3 to match the video, or I can have a scenario that works the other way around. So it's something to
think about, yeah.
consider.
So just a question. So when we're talking about encoding and decoding, so what is the difference then when they use the word running discrete audio?
All right. So if we're running discrete audio, now discrete can be a little misleading. In other words, I can use AC3, which is already encoded. I can decode that. But the output that comes out is then turned into either an analog signal or maybe even a digital AES signal. The moment those signals are running on independent lines, feeding, say, for instance, each speaker, the moment I feed a speaker individually with an audio channel, that's discrete. If I had to feed ICR from my OB via the bird discrete, I'm going to need an uplink that requires 6 AES full bandwidth PCM channels. Then it will be discrete.
Yeah. So
the problem is I have to pay for that bandwidth.
Yeah. So in the scenario that you were mentioning earlier, if you're broadcasting to 8 broadcasters around the world, you could send up to an ICR discrete and everybody could then just encode themselves, but they
Correct.
would have to keep their head in terms of what's coming when you label your systems, your metadata, right? And they have to do their part, right?
So in a case like that, if I do discrete, I would again use something like a blitzstone, which identifies all my channels as discretes so that they can do whatever encoding they require. But now I have to book 6 PCM channels instead of just the standard 2. Now, this is where Dolby E is very handy, and that is by default, we typically have 2, maybe 4 channels for an uplink. If we have the luxury of 4 channels, we're going to do 6 for Dolby E, which only uses a stereo pair. Everything gets encoded. The 6 channels required for the 5.1 gets encoded into those. And I do a discrete stereo pair on the other 2 channels. If I only have 2, I can actually do all 8, but you can then imagine I now have to squeeze 8 channels into the space of 2. This is also where the problem comes in if you want to rearrange audio. You're using an encoding process that is, the codecs are so good that you can barely tell the difference. But we're talking about, let's say, 384 kilobits a second for 8 channels worth of audio versus 1,200 kilobits a second for a standard PCM stereo. You can see that you're down to about a quarter of the bandwidth with 4 times the channel count. Things start to get a bit hairy. If you decode and re-encode, there is potential for things to go wrong, and for quality definitely not to remain intact in the same way as if we can keep that chain undisturbed. These codecs are so good. Dolby has done over the years lots of perceptual tests and things like that, where on a 384 kilobit Dolby E stream in 5.1, there are very, very few people that can tell the difference between the discrete PCM 6-channel delivery versus the 5.1 AC3 delivery. We can even bring the AC3 down to 192 kilobits, and most people will still not be able to tell the difference. But the moment I split that into discrete channels and I try and work with them, in other words, use it as I would otherwise say in post-production or something like that, I've got limited bandwidth on all my frequencies, the channels, everything. It's for those of you that's familiar with MP3 and what that does. Once you've taken a wave to MP3 and you make a wave again, you definitely don't have the wave you started off with. It's the same thing. The perceptual quality on that first encode is really, really good. Once you've had to decode and re-encode that, there is a significant loss in the next generation that you've generated from there. Interestingly enough, Dolby E itself can withstand, I think if memory serves me right, about 7 iterations of encode and decode without generating artifacts or noticeable audio quality drops. Okay. So when we're talking about encode and recode for Dolby E, our biggest problem is the timing issue, the one frame that penalty that we pay every time we go through a cycle. Not so much the perceived quality. On the AC3 side, the penalty is a lot bigger.
Well, that was a nice sidechain into Dolby E. So let's get back to loudness. Yeah. So just a comment here from Paul Smith, communication. Just to explain to everybody, obviously when we do all of what we're talking about, the OB van also sets up a communication link via the uplink to the comm stations in the final control, FCC, ICR. So we can talk to those technicians at those different points. They come up on the comms panel and we can communicate with them directly. And you have to keep communicating and make sure that you have, and I was mentioning it the other night as well, someone has to be listening to it. There's always quality control. Someone's listening to it. When I do productions, I know Tinus, when it's a project we're working on together, he's watching off air, I'm working live. And I'll ask questions, you'll send comments, and we're working together on obviously trying to deliver the best possible result within that scenario. And as one person can't do all of this on his own, there's multiple people involved from a technical perspective, and every single one of them needs to know their role and understand where they sit in the context of everything. And you have a guy watching soccer in ICR on the side because he's done his uplink. He's not paying attention to your link anymore. So if he's done his job right, everything's fine. But if you didn't spend the time with lineup, and then it's too late. You have to have that communication well in advance. And we don't always get that. You pay for that bird time. I know that we often sit with a scenario where they start the uplink, they get the uplink going, and then your production assistant's she's got to talk to MCR about ads and ad times and ad break times and schedules and this and a bunch of other stuff and all that. And the audio guys are trying to do lineups and everybody's stealing that comm channel. So there's even workflows within the OB vans to manage who talks when. And we channel everything through the production assistant because they're in charge. They're the ones that are talking to MCR all the time. So we tell them we need 5 minutes for lineup, and then we've got 5 minutes to line up. And if we find a fault, we fix the fault, we communicate. When we're done with that, we tell them we're done with lineups, it's all yours. She can take over and discuss ad breaks, or he can take over and discuss ad breaks. But it's an ongoing communication. And once the show starts, MCR stays on the line with the comms pretty much throughout the whole thing. If there's anything with audio, they can feed back to us immediately. If they notice something, or if we have an issue that we notice, we can get involved. Obviously, there's a limitation to what you can do once you're on air. You can't unplug and replug and repatch and do all these kind of things. So, you have to do these things before the time. That's what we got lineup time for.
In that note, I just want to mention one of the critical things that's not solved with purely a lineup is sync. So we often end up doing the clapper board or just a simple hand clap. We have somebody standing in front of the camera and doing a nice loud hand clap with a microphone close enough to pick up the clap
on the stage,
on the stage, but so that there's no time delay from the position where the clap was made to the microphone. So the mic needs to be close enough that we can actually say what the camera is picking up. The microphone is close enough to resemble no delay in the sound at that moment, and that's how we overcome
we normally
potential.
We normally have a floor manager like Kai or Sabu or someone, and they've got a shot mic which they're managing the crowd with, and we'll get them just to go stand with that actual microphone, do a clap test, and speak, and we check, and and it's not for us just in the van; it's all the way in MCR that they're checking that the sync is right,
all the way down the chain,
all the way down the chain. Yeah,
because you see the contortionist move, they pull.
Yeah.
And to get the microphone and clap. Yeah.
Yeah, gets funny.
That one.
But it is something that we pay attention to, and there's a lot of little things when you're on site. And what's interesting about it is you've got to have the aptitude for it, because you've only got so much time. You have to know what you're going to do. Once the bird's up, there's a set order of events that we follow. We communicate with everybody in the chain. We don't want to waste the producer's time. We can't say we didn't have enough time, because that means we weren't ready. We know exactly what we need to do. We've had a situation before where we go live, we do the link, and the feedback we get is we're not seeing right, or we're seeing two lefts, or phasing, and then we need to respond to that ASAP. And the guys in MCR, on that side can only do X amount. They've got limited technical interaction. Sometimes it's something we can do on our side. But it's not like, oh, there's a problem, now what? Scratch your head. We need to be proactive, be responsive, be able to anticipate. And, if it comes down to it's quicker for me on my side to swap left and right than them on their side to swap left and right, I'll do it, because we're fixing the chain, from the start. Ideally, that's not the case, but that's just things that you need to be able to do. And obviously, like you said, digital these days, it's so quick to do a bunch of these things on at any point, but it has to be monitored. So, loudness.
It can go wrong very quickly, but we should be able to fix them very quickly as well. And on that note, I just want to mention a last one. I've had it a number of times where each OB has its own challenges on the day, and it just so happens that in that particular case, or this particular case I'd like to refer to, there was no time left for lineups. We were busy with quite a big production, and there were rehearsals involved. And because it was of a competitive nature, everybody needed to be given a chance to rehearse. If we managed to do the lineup, somebody would have fallen out the bus in terms of their opportunity to do a rehearsal. There's, of course, the counter argument to that, and that is if we get something wrong on that chain, the last one that didn't get to rehearse might not have been caught up with any disadvantage, but the first one that falls into the next bracket might, because there's a problem with the link up. So what we can do in a scenario like that, which we've effectively done, is do a lineup simply from the
source.
From the bird up. So I will send something without using my master outs that would affect the control room and where everybody else is sitting. I'll do a quick repatch, send tone just to the lines that are going out to the link up. In severe cases, the link up can generate their own tone, but then I'm not assured that what I'm sending to that point is correct. So if I can interfere or intervene, it's down to routing and how you've set up your systems, whether that's even possible. But in most cases, when I do an OB, I do that as a separate. So it's same output.
You also get into your workflow. I mean, if you're working with different engineers, and I was saying this on Monday, you get into a habit of you work to the required output from scratch. I don't wait until it's time for lineups to fix my loudness and to fix my levels. I'm working in that already. So before the link up is happening, we've done lineups with the van next door. We've done quality checks. I know where I'm sitting. I get a feedback from him. I know where he's sitting, all that. So if you do that technical lineup that you were just talking about, you know that our signal is sorted. And then if you go on air,
Yes.
and you might have to do a little adjustment just on your master out, either up or down, that's a lot quicker to fix, than not having done lineups at all throughout the week of rehearsals,
At all.
just in your own
So
environment.
in this particular case, what we then could do is have the lineup done sort of in the background and have a phone conversation with ICR to make sure that that is working out. That gets tricky in a different way because you're now not on comms, you're not going through the proper channels, but these were, unique circumstances at the time, and still important enough to try and get to a place where everything is sorted before you hit the mark. On that note, right after we've done the technical lineup, I would switch to the actual output of the rehearsal and get ICR to monitor that, because that was the only way left for them to check sync and phase. But now they have an actual performance with lip sync, no clapping, unfortunately, which is your best way to check sync. So now they have to pay close attention to lips and actually see if that works. And then on phasing, there's a couple of classic things that stand out. You will be very familiar with them from a music perspective, but that classic thing where, especially in a stereo signal, it is the variations in your stereo signal that's the only stuff that survives. So typically you will find your center channel is what goes amiss. One of the classic telltale signs is the bass, especially, that disappears out of the mix. Everything starts to sound rather
the
thin.
reverb sounds amazing.
It's huge because it's all over the place. It's the only thing that doesn't cancel with anything because it's on its own. Yeah. Beautiful. So once you've solved that, that's your lineup resolved. If your lineup and those sort of things are done, technically the only difference, and this is where we now get to loudness, and that's where the conversation gets interesting. Technically, if everything is equal from this point on, you should be able to have a broadcast that, bar the encoding, in other words, that bit rate reduction, similar to MP3, your broadcast should sound very, very, very similar to
what you're sending,
the actual show that you wanted. Yes. On that note, my partner in crime, Keith Davies, you'll be very familiar with Keith as well. Over the years, we've done quite a few tests on all our local channels in particular, where we take from both post and live events, the actual OB recording and then an off-air recording, and we do a nulling. That is, we line these up perfectly, and you invert the phase on one of the two, and you sum them. What you're left with is the difference. In other words, that they got lost in the transmission. And in most cases, that is minimal. It's mostly in the high end and the very low end.
And the very
good
wide.
News on the high end, and the very wide. So when you get to the far extremities in terms of panning. The good news is for the listener at home, they wouldn't know. If you had to A/B the signal, it's very, very hard to tell. The good news is most people are rather on the deaf side when it comes to high frequencies. Most things above 12, 14K don't really translate all that well across television anyway. If you have a high-end system, yes, they should be capable of doing that. But then probably the people listening to the signal is not capable of hearing much past 14K anyway. Most of the stuff that goes missing is on the other side of 14, so 14, 15, 16K and up. And then, of course, the bottom end. And unless you have a sub in your setup, you're pretty much not even going to notice that missing. So that encode that takes place, that bitrate reduction that takes place, really only affects, like we say, the peripheries in terms of the panning and the very high and very low end. That meaty part, the mid end of your production, actually stays very, very well intact. And this is where loudness plays a very, very important role. Right. How do you want to start that one?
So, okay, first of all, why do we have loudness? For laymen at home listening, what is the benefit of loudness being controlled / enforced?
So let's just start with a short little history lesson. The loudness wars, that's something that's been going on for generations. And this is true for every genre that has existed in terms of recording space. Even records have suffered that. So if we talk vinyl, I think we managed, even in the olden analog days, 1 dB raise in volume every decade until CD kicked in, and we managed 1 dB a year until we ran out of headroom, and then we started crunching stuff. The same sort of thing happened in television for different reasons, and in many cases actually for the same reasons, and that is this idea that louder is better. We somehow believe that if it's louder, we pay more attention to this. And that is absolutely true, but for all the wrong reasons. And I'll explain briefly. I do an exercise whenever I do training with most people where I will play them a variety of clips and have them judge quality, sonically, things like that. And in there, I'll sneak in a couple that are actually identical, but they have a volume difference of 1, 2, and 3 dBs, then 4, 5, and 6. When you get to the 4s, the 5s, and the 6s, most people will instantaneously say to you, that one's louder. What are you trying to do? Fool us here. 3 dBs, most people do not tell that it's louder. They pick it as a preferred, in other words, better than the one that I just played. So on 3 decibels, the volume difference is little enough not to be so extreme that you go, somebody turned up the volume. But somehow it sounds better. It's got to do with how the human ear works. The louder we play stuff, the more frequencies we hear. That's possibly a discussion for another day.
Yeah.
Don't want to go down that rabbit hole at the moment. But you get the point. Even 1 decibel, which is the smallest increment that the human ear should be able to detect in terms of a change in volume. Now, if I play you 2 clips with only 1 dB difference, and I don't bump that volume up, I literally just play 1 clip and then the other, you won't instantaneously notice that there was a volume change. But a lot of people will pick the slightly louder one as the perceived better. For advertisements, not knowing why, absolutely. So in adverts, you got to a place where if an ad could be louder than the other one, not as subliminal or as subtle as I've just described, but noticeably, people felt that drew attention to the ad. And that's how that loudness war started. So there was a fight about my ad went out and the guy right before or right after me was louder than I was. So the challenge is out to the engineer to try and generate something more. As we all know, we got to a place where once ads come on, what do? You grab the mute button. So it's actually rather counterintuitive as things stand at the moment. It's definitely not it ended up not achieving what they set out to do. So our biggest challenge and our most complaints came from the fact that there's this massive volume jump, up to twice as loud ads as program content. And if you were doing certain types of shows where the content is quieter by design, those jumps would be even bigger. And it's very, very disturbing. So the whole loudness concept came about for us to try and mitigate that. Over the years, people have tried all sorts of other issues. You will be very well aware of the ALCs that we've had in place over the years, Jungers, Optimods, things like that.
ALCs
they
being
do some
automatic loudness control.
ALC, not the loudness. In the early days, automatic level controls.
Yeah.
So we'll get to the automatic loudness control in a moment, also a form of ALC. But the original, so Optimods and Jungers and things like that, they did not control loudness. They simply looked at peaks. And the idea was the moment an ad came through and the peak was very loud, it would compress it to try and bring it down. So what we ended up with was even more compressed audio than you had before. There's actually some research that suggests this overly compressed audio generates something similar to road rage. Yeah, so in any case, the idea has always been to try and bring the program content closer to each other. Also from a perspective of switching between channels. Now, if you have multiple channels, 2, 3, 4, 10, 30, 40, oh my word, and you start jumping between one service and another, and you have to crank up the volume to listen to one and turn down the volume to listen to the next, or wake up the neighbors in the process, or maybe even yourself, that's very undesirable. So that whole idea of trying to control perceived loudness came into play. And it was around about 2006 that the ITU came up with a way to measure perceived loudness. And that's where a tech doc was generated called the BS1770. This document is regularly updated, and we'll put a link to that document. All our loudness specifications refer back to this as a point of origin. So absolutely every kind of loudness standard refers back to the BS 1770. Whether that be the Americans with the A85, or the Australians, or South Africa, or Europe with R128. We share the R128 with Europe. R128 is what we adopted in 2013 when we brought out Florian camera. And that was actually in an exercise with myself, Keith, and Duncan, and ASE. You guys were involved with that one. MediaTek, that's correct. And 2 years later, we had a follow-up. That was called the Loudness Summit, and then we had the follow-up 2 years later. And there was a whole adoption that happened, and we'll talk a bit about that process next, because this is where the next level of ALC comes in, and this was a big problem. All right, so the BS 1770 came out, and this was a means to measure loudness, but just to measure it. Nobody quite knew what to do with that. And that's where all the standards came from. So the EBU formed the P-Loud group, of which Florian Camera was the chair. And they took the standard and wrote an implementation, if you will, and hence the recommendation. R128, incidentally, is the 128th recommendation that came out of the EBU. That's where it got its number and therefore its name from. R128, meaning recommendation number 128. So if they were a little bit earlier or later, it would have been 26 or 27 or 29 or whatever the case may be. We just happened to fall on that number, 128.
Can I just interrupt?
And the recommendation...
Just to say that all the documentations and stuff that he's talking about now, we're actually going to drop them in the link on the chat. I think there's about 5 or 6 different documents, so we're going to just drop all of them in there because you're talking about different ones at random stages. So those who are interested, yes, there's a nice bunch of reading material that's going to come your way now.
So the first one that I referred to was the 1770. The others that I'm going to refer to now is then the actual EBU documentation. That will be the 22, 41, 42, 43, and 44. These are the actual recommendations that were written by the EBU, not the ITU. So that's where our R128 spec comes from. And there's actually a master document to that sort of binds those 4, well, actually all 5 if you think about it together, which is sort of a summary of the R128 spec, and that's all the docs that you're going to post the links for.
Yeah, and that's the document I was referring to on Monday as well.
Correct. So these are all the documents that refer right back to the source. So anything else you read is from third parties, people interpreting that, stuff like that. These are the original tech docs written on the standard. I think I did include in there also a link to the TC Electronics website.
You did, yeah.
I think they do one of the better explanations in sound engineer layman speak, if I can say that.
For us dumb guys.
So if you, but not just layman, if you're a sound engineer, they really talk your language. So if you go through that page, you've got a landing page, which is sort of an overview, and then at the top there's about, I think, 5 tabs that take you through the who's and why's and what's and the how-tos and that sort of stuff. It's a really, really good read. And why I like their stuff is they were involved in this whole process right from the start. Incidentally, LRA, which is one of the parameters that we use in Loudness, was in effect donated by TC. It's their algorithm. It's their IP, if you will, that they donated to the P-Loud group to include LRA. Because Loudness, by definition, is a open source, open spec. It's not proprietary. At the time R128 came out, Dolby had their own form of loudness called dial norm. It's still around. In fact, Netflix has just revived that. So if you do anything for Netflix, guess what? You're mixing to dial norm. Different story, but the same idea. Primary difference there is we use dialogue as an anchor, whereas with R128, we basically use overall content to derive perceived loudness. So back to the original problem, we're trying to get to a place where the difference between ads and programs, and even programs and the difference between channels is what we're trying to level out. So that when you sit down in front of the television, you don't have to do your own mixing via your remote. If you've dialed in your preferred viewing volume, it should ideally just stay there. The only time you will turn it up or down is if it's your preference to listen to something louder or quieter, not because it's being presented to you too loud or too soft. The initial take on for this was people jumping on the wagon, creating then automatic loudness leveling. These are devices that people would then put, or broadcasters would put at the end of the chain that would achieve or try to achieve an average loudness level. And that turned out a groot gemors. Part of the reason for this is if you understand loudness, I need to get my average. Now for R128, we work with an average of minus 23 LUFS. You need to derive that average over the total duration of your program. If you want to try and control loudness at the end stage of a program, you're not going to achieve that by doing that. So to try and achieve some sort of loudness control, but keeping in mind that ads jump out as badly as they do, they have to narrow that window within which the loudness adjustment happens. So typically that window ends up very small, as in a couple of seconds. If you're lucky, something like 5 or 6, in most cases less than that. The net effect of that being, if a signal comes in and it is too loud, this loudness leveler looks at it and goes, oh, it's too loud, and it starts pulling the signal down.
While still in content of some other source.
Correct. But this is now on broadcast. So if it's pulling this down and your very next portion is actually a piece of audio that was very low, that now ends up lower than intended. This ALC now reads this super low content and tries to correct for that by pushing the signal up. If your next signal is a very loud one, it ends up louder than intended. And you end up with a seesaw effect starting to happen. The system constantly trying to adjust for itself in a very, very narrow window. Instead of a half an hour show being measured at minus 23 in half an hour, I can run up and down within that half an hour quite significantly. And we'll talk about that in the way, especially yourself and I have structured shows in the past to try and accommodate that. Whereas with an ALC at the end of a broadcast chain, they're trying to achieve that in a very, very short space of time.
Yeah.
And that is the problem. We'll talk about the influences and the effects that has and how we've tried to work around that. The ideal is not to have that kind of ALC at the end of a chain. And that's where we see our local broadcasters starting to step up quality control on delivery. So now you get to a place where when you deliver a show, they ask for you to deliver it to spec minus 23 LUFS. Why? If we have the show run at minus 23 and we're broadcasting, then there's no need to do any ALC work down the chain. The program's going out correctly. So if it comes in incorrect, they fail it, kick it back. You've got to correct it. It gets sent back. This is something that changed over the years. In 2013, when we introduced it, the broadcasters did a lot of that correction still for you. By 2015, I remember the date was the 1st of April. I thought it was a very funny April Fool's joke at the time. They said we're going to reject material from that point on. I wonder if anybody got that note on the 1st of April and thought it was a joke. But from that date onwards, you had to correct the material yourself. That is the point. Now we get to FCC, ICR, and FCC for that matter. When you have OBs, it's not post-produced content most of the time. So your challenge is, how do you ensure loudness compliance on a live feed coming in? So these days, we tend to find ALCs on our live feeds coming into our ICRs. Unless we can do an assurance to them that the broadcast is actually going to be to spec. So this is something that we then work very hard to, and somebody like Keith Davies and very often myself will render our services. If I'm not actually mixing the show, I will go and assist and do quality assurance in the sense that we will double check all the chains along the way to make sure everything is done correctly, but also that the mix happens in a manner that will assure loudness compliance when the mix is done. And now we get to that part. A lot of what you do obviously is music mixing. And for the kind of shows that we end up mixing, music is the primary content. We try and make music the hero of the show, if you will. So to achieve that, we actually allow music to run a little bit louder than the required minus 23. How do we manage that, Christo? I won't give away all our secrets in one go. But we allow music to peak a little bit higher. Let's say minus 21 or so, maybe minus 20. Which means I need to counter that with other elements within the show. So for instance, VTs that's been packaged would have been packaged at minus 23, but I will play them out at minus 24, buying me that 1 LU across
the show.
Sort of across, well, in the portions that those happen, absolutely. But the VTs don't always balance out with the duration of the music. So where you have components where there's, for instance, judging happening, there's a very interesting thing that happens, and that is voice, naked voice on its own. In other words, without music or much around it. Actually sounds pretty loud at minus 23. If music is within context and it's blended and mixed in, minus 23 works pretty well. But if you listen to a talk show at minus 23, it's actually a little loud. So we have the luxury of the judging parts where there's largely talking and you find that your audience is quite quiet. I can actually mix that even lower, like in a minus 25. Instead of a 23 or a 24, 25 or even 26 is what I can get away with. And all of a sudden, between the VTs and the judges and a few other elements that I cheat lower, I allow the music component to be a little bit more lively. And also remember, if I'm running VTs at 24 and you're mixing music at, let's say, 21, you already have that sort of difference in perceived volume between the two, which makes the music feel a little louder than it otherwise would be. The net result that we're striving for at the end of the day is the entire broadcast needs to come out to minus 23. Now, on a lot of these shows, the shows have structure. We rehearse them sometimes from a Thursday to a Sunday. So we've got a lot of time to get this down pat. When we're doing sport and live events like that, the game changes significantly. I do not have the luxury of rehearsal. I may be mixing a cricket or a soccer or a rugby match where not much happens, or they score 7 tries in the whole game. I can find myself in a lot of trouble very, very quickly. The standard actually allows me a little bit of leeway there, saying in a live environment I can mix to plus minus 1 LU. So in sport, I'll tend to aim for the lower end if the game is not very exciting, allowing for some headroom when things get excitable, so that I just have that little something to push towards. A general rule of thumb for loudness is start slightly softer so you can end bigger. Most people make the mistake of hitting it hard, and then when you get to the end of the show, you constantly have to pull back to try and make the numbers, so your show peters out towards the end. There are tips and tricks to start a show with a bang and then buy your time in the early stages towards the middle, but you have to pull those numbers back so that you can get to the end of the show and have something left to end on a bang rather than a squib. Something like golf, for instance, is quite a challenging one because there's not much happening and most of the time. Everybody's whispering, everything's quiet, even the music that you're playing, even the people watching the game. I found it very funny when you watch people watching golf. They're whispering to each other as well. It's like they're scared they're going to disrupt the guy putting. So very different kind of scenarios to work with. But for each of those, you're going to find ways to deal with loudness and incorporate that so that when you're done with your broadcast, you've achieved your minus 23 or less. So please take note, being below minus 23 is allowed. In most cases, not preferable, but you are allowed to be short of the mark. We don't want you to exceed the mark. In some cases, if you end up with an overall show of minus 25, but it was a lot of whispering and really quiet, if that was good for the content, if that worked within the content space, then that is fantastic. That's in a nutshell, the loudness scenario. Yeah. And our other issue is LRA.
Yes.
I know the other night you briefly touched on LRA. LRA is not a specification that we need to adhere to in terms of a deliverable, but it is a very, very important tool to help you understand what your content is suitable for. For instance,
your end user. What are they on headphones? Are they in the cars? Are they at home? Are they in a cinema? Or where?
Correct.
So it's contextual.
Contextual, and so in many cases, when you are mixing something, your question should be, where is this going? If it's for cinema, I've got a lot more scope to work with. Standard broadcast, you've got less so. And then even within, so let's just stick to broadcast for a moment. If I'm talking broadcast into my living room, I even have breakdowns there in terms of show types. In other words, if I have a talk show, the odds of you having an LRA of 7 on a talk show is rather small. If you go deal with dialogue, you will find out it's actually quite a narrow band that you're working with. A lot of your LRAs on dialogue is going to end up on 3, 4, if you're lucky 5, because people were yelling a little. But if it's a talk, and nobody gets terribly excited, you're going to end up with a very narrow LRA of 3 or 4. Whereas a magazine show will come out at a typical 7. If you have a drama, for instance, or a soap, you're going to end up towards the 8s or 9s, maybe even a 10. And if you do sort of our music type shows, and depending on how we structure it, that can be anywhere from an 8 to a 12. Now, if you're doing a show like that, a music show, and you have a 12, that's acceptable. But if you're doing a talk show and you get a 12, oops, there's a problem. If I do a magazine show and I end up with a 12, I'm doing something wrong. If I do a magazine show and I end up with a 3, I'm more than likely over-compressing. So these are little guides that you can use the LRA number for. It's not a fixed number. My rule of thumb is I do my LRA sort of within a gauge. In other words, I say, let's say magazine show should be an 8. And for an LRA, I give myself a plus minus 2 leeway. So if I end up on a 6, I'm still happy. If I end up on a 10, I'm still happy, so long as I understand the context and the content. In other words, I go, yeah, there was a lot of talking in this show, hence the lower number of a 6 or a 7. Or there was a lot of musical elements in this, or maybe we did some dramatizations of stuff, which created a lot of shades in my dynamic range. And please note that dynamic range and loudness range is not the same thing. Dynamic range is basically the difference between the loudest and the quietest moment in your mix. LRA is the average loudness, highest versus lowest, average. And we throw away the highest 5 and the lowest 10%. And the reasoning behind that is that we don't have, for instance, a gunshot or 2 in a movie. You may have a movie with just one gunshot in it. You don't want the gunshot alone to skew the LRA.
It's almost like it's ignoring the momentary.
Almost.
Yeah.
It's really just chopping off that top 5%. Yes. So anything that's shot through. But if a lot of that happens, your 5% margin will shrink in terms of where that definition for
the averages
sits. And the same then at the bottom, we throw away the bottom 10%. So that's how I can use LRA within broadcast, even so I can get to a place where I say, if I'm purposing content for in-car use, I'm going to use a narrow LRA. But by the same token, if I'm doing broadcast, but I'm doing a talk show, I'm going to have a narrow LRA. And that's not necessarily suggestive of something that's meant for a car, but think about it. LRA of 3, perfect for in-car use. Yeah. Talk show, broadcast 3, it will translate to both cases perfectly.
Yes.
Movies, big problem. Typical movie has an LRA of in excess of 18 LU. Some of them run into 20s and 30s. And the problem with those are when you bring them into your lounge and trying to watch it, even at home, we're not even talking about on your phone. That's a different disaster. You're still sitting, when the dialogue bits come up, you turn up the volume so you can hear nicely. The big bang shootout happens and you're realizing, oh crap, I'm waking the neighbors, if not the cat or your wife. You turn down the volume and that cycle continues.
But that's also, I mean, that movie was created for a cinema, which is a controlled environment with a very low noise floor. So you, as an audience member, you can appreciate the immersive feel that you get from that dynamic.
Indeed. In movies, we have a different technique of mixing as well. When I mix film, I mix with dialogue as my sort of centerpiece with everything sitting around it. TV is slightly different in that respect. But for a lot of television applications, we will then take film and repurpose it by reducing the LRA. There's a couple of techniques that can be used for that. The most effective that we found in terms of repurposing is to take a very, very good compressor with very low and slow settings. In other words, you make your attack as fast as you can, your release as slow as you can, and your threshold as low as you can. And then you use a ratio of as low as 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, and you run your program through that and make a correction to get your loudness level correct again. And you will find that that will start to reduce your LRA. It will have side effects. In other words, quieter pieces are getting louder. Louder pieces are obviously going to get quieter. That's less noticeable. In other words, the louder stuff that you're bringing down is not nearly as noticeable as the quieter bits that are coming up, unless you're starting to run into numbers like 1.5, 1.6, 1.7, where we're now starting to feel compression on the louder bits, all in an effort to try and reduce the LRA. You can get to a place where you cannot effectively bring the LRA down to a reasonable number. It actually requires a remix of the content, or at the very least an understanding of the content and going, even though it's going to TV and I've reduced it significantly, let's say from a minus 24 to a 16. Now a 16 is still big for TV, but if it is a movie that has lots of expansive bits in it, lots of quiet scenes and then big musical cues, that could still work, because the reason you're getting that big variation is not necessarily because stuff is going to impede you in the same way as the original where you have to mix with the remote. Even that 16 LRA might be listenable on television. Unfortunately, because of how this works, it's down to you having to apply your own judgment using your ears.
Yeah.
You have to make an adjustment, listen to it, get a feel for it, and go, yeah, that will
Exactly,
work.
yeah. So I'm gonna jump in here. What you just said actually is a whole intro to why, for example, on the music live side, not managing your signal and having it being compressed by someone else down the chain has such a big effect on your mix.
Yes.
So I'm not going to get into that now. I want to get to some of the questions. We've had quite an interesting discussion. Joshua Lewis has contributed quite nice things. He asked the technical question. With all the broadcasts from the president and the minister, why is there be such a big difference between the RF or satellite? In other words, if you're watching terrestrial or you're watching satellite, the human brain would tell you the satellite should be the better one. But we're coming with a signal from our public broadcaster. So why is there such a big difference between those two feeds if you switch between them? Spot. I'll let you answer that one.
So by the way, the RF problem will be resolved pretty soon. It should have been resolved, about 10 years ago? But we won't go down that route. So RF is a terrestrial transmission and it's analog. RF has got its own challenges in the way we transmit and to get the best out of that signal. But it's a completely separate signal path from the digital path that's being used if you watch it via satellite, or even the new digital terrestrial DTT network that is out. You will find the digital terrestrial will mimic the satellite, because we are working with digital bandwidth that has got far more fixed ranges within which it works, and loudness being applied within the digital domain. On the analog side of things, we're talking about transmitters, and to have those function optimally, we're actually looking at a different it's a different kettle of fish altogether.
Different technology.
Different technology. applying loudness in the analog world was actually a very difficult thing to do. We were far more concerned with where a program peaks in the traditional transmission of signal.
BPM.
If my signal, yes, so if my signal peaked a little bit too high, I could do damage to a transmitter. And that's where a lot of our compression comes from, both in the way we prepare programs, but also in the optimods and Jungers that's been put in place to protect largely the transmitters in that chain. So when you look at an optimod or a Junger, their original job was to make sure that if you did not do quality control properly and a program slips through with peaks that are in excess of what is required or allowed, I should say, you could blow the transmitter. Now, to give you an idea, something like Betacam SP, which we used to use, depending on which broadcast you were looking at and what calibrations we were working with, that was another story altogether. But Betacam SP was theoretically capable of delivering plus 18 dB in terms of signal, and that's over zero, above zero. Our broadcast equipment, our transmitters, are able to handle plus 8. And there's a little bit of a safety margin built in that with another plus 2, so technically plus 10. But compressors aren't good enough to do the brick wall thing entirely to that plus 8. So we had that little bit of a 2 dB play in there. So you'll see that with a Betacam SP analog signal, you were capable of seriously exceeding the technical limitations and therefore doing some destructive harm to analog transmitters, even in the television side of things. So applying loudness to content that was asking for a different kind of limiting and compressing the way we used to mix, it just doesn't work. It's actually very, very difficult to achieve both loudness and traditional specs. And that's why you'll find that our public broadcaster has a bit of had a bit of a dilemma, especially in the early days, with trying to deal with both loudness and analog delivery on Betacam SP. So the path that is being utilized for the RF versus the digital signal is different, even though it's the same signal. But the signal that's going to the digital platform is being curtailed to suit the digital transmission, but it comes off the back of an analog one. Also, the two mediums are different. So how's your TV set up? You've got an RF tuner inside your television and you've got a decoder on the other side. If you were technical enough, you can actually set those things up so that the inverse starts to happen, and that is that you can get your decoder to give you more signal than your RF reception does. RF has got a few other issues. In the long run, RF does not carry the same quality that digital does, both in terms of bandwidth and crosstalk. And a lot of our RF transmissions end up being mono.
Yeah.
So that also adds a little bit of oomph, can we say, to your perception of especially something like voice. So if I combine my left and my right, for those of you that are familiar with that, your left and right signals get combined. You actually get a little bit of a lift in your overall signal. It sounds fuller. It's actually a little bit louder. That's not the be-all and end-all of the reasons that you will hear a difference, but that's one of the reasons you might hear a difference.
So a follow-up question you had then is also, just on some of the recent, there's been a sync issue, and the difference between left and right on the satellite, but not on the RF. And I think you've just answered that, where, again, different paths, different lineup procedures. I don't think our current uplinks and quality control is, I don't know. I mean, I don't know who's doing those broadcasts and where they're coming from, but they do follow various routes to get to the different outcomes.
Correct. And I would just like to mention something else, and that is going back to Dolby E and AC3, which is your Dolby Digital signal. Dolby E is linked to picture. We actually synchronize that. AC3 is not. So AC3 has the ability to float. It's got markers and things, and it should be pulling itself right every now and again. But there is a risk with AC3 of the signal drifting. And if anything goes wrong along the line and that gets misaligned, or the markers don't line up, you can end up with audio out of sync. You can also end up in the same scenario we described earlier, where the signal goes through a path that ended up having a delay in it that is causing part of the problem.
He just made a comment here that the live he was talking to was a YouTube live stream. So YouTube obviously runs their own algorithms and stuff, and I've seen that before on streams, even on Facebook lives, where if you refresh a page, everything syncs back into order. But you can have because of the algorithms, because they will prioritize a picture or audio on different levels. So if your picture glitches, your audio won't glitch, and then you get that drift that you were talking about.
You get the jump, and then the drift is there because the markers are no longer lined. Refresh the page, and you'll get the markers lining up.
Correct.
If that little split happens, and it can happen with audio as well. You can get a scenario. AC3 is quite renowned for this one. You break the AC3 feed just for a split second, and you're going to have no audio for 2 or 3 seconds while the system tries to catch itself. It needs to find a little flag and say, this needs to match up with that particular part of the video, and then it starts decoding and streaming again. So AC3 very volatile in that respect. Whereas Dolby E, not so much. It's only that volume thing that we spoke about earlier. But in streaming, you get that a lot. A glitch happened and the audio and the video is out. Refresh your page and chances are
everything comes
that
back
would
into
fix
line.
it.
So Joshua has made quite a few comments. I think most of them self-explanatory. As we've been saying stuff, he's been remarking on some stuff, which has been great. Thanks for that. Njabulo asked a question about a broadcast that happened, where the public were complaining during the broadcast, and he's asking, do you think the broadcast took left right from the venue, or did they have their own input channel straight out of the splitters? Obi-Van, obviously, when you listen to a broadcast, unless you're involved in it, you don't know. If I'm in a broadcast and something goes wrong, I know it's me before most people know it's me, hopefully, because I'm in that context. Or if I hear a problem, I can respond to it based on the knowledge of our signal flow and what's happening. I spoke about this a lot on Monday, where I can't just go sit in the van and ignore what's happening in the room. If the creative director decides he wants to go do a podium mic, out on an ego ramp 20 meters ahead, and they want to put a little speech mic there, 20 meters in front of a PA, you cannot blame me. For the echo effect.
If the howl comes, that's part of.
Well, not if it's not howling. If it's Marius, someone, there's no feedback, everything, but the people in the room has to hear. So the PA is on, and you have a physical delay of 20 meters.
You're going to have an echo at least.
Exactly, onto the mic, and then your director in the van, your technical director is going, fix the echo. Like, I can't. Run into the venue, grab the person, pull them back 20 meters. So there's something. So we have these conversations. When you work with experienced guys, I've got a list of technical directors, which I've got a lot of respect for. We work well with them. And they understand these aspects. And they'll work with the audio guys, because they're all about the picture and all that. But they'll work with the audio guys because they want to ensure the product. So if in the rehearsal I ask, can we move that podium? And I've done this after they've lined up a shot, which means they've got a camera deck in place, lined up
lighting
perfect.
And everything, it's got to change.
And and now we rehearse it. I'm like, it's not going to work. Sometimes I've said this before, and then he said, "Listen, let's try it," because that's ideally what he wants. Me and Michael had this one year. Michael Schneider. I made a comment about something. He goes, I hear you, but I really want the shot. Let me try. So he tried it. He got it. We got the mic there. And then he asked. And his question was actually an acknowledgement. He goes, I hear it, because he could hear what I was implying. And then it's a matter of the crew's got to get in. They've got to move a camera riser, replot the whole thing. Let's fix the scenario. But it's something that you're working with people with. So if your creative production is not working with you, your broadcast can have a lot of things, regardless of where the audio comes from. It can be coming off left out or front of house. It can be a separate mix. But what happens in the room has a phenomenal effect on the quality of what goes to air. If your front of house engineer is there to have the time of his life and goes screaming loud, out of context, that'll have an impact on our show. If he's not tuned his PA well, or he's not prepared himself well, and he's causing feedback, there's nothing I can do about it. It's that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. We go as far, if it's me and Adrian, for example, or me and Marius in front of house, Marius would call me over comms and say, do I need to pull back a little bit? Because he's running maybe an MC mic or something into the room. And if it's a lapel mic especially, a lapel mic's quite ambient. So I hear the room, and he's got a bit of headroom. Or I would say, can you pull that back a little bit? And he goes, oof, I'll try. And I know that he's got a context to deliver. That's why a lot of these shows we actually end up with our host on a handheld, so they can take command of a room that's screaming.
To try and
limit that echo effect, and that people can, because you need to hear it in the room. It doesn't look great on TV, but it works for that context. And once the room's relaxed and your other hosts are on lapel mics, it works well.
So live shows, the big challenge is always you've got a crowd of 300 to 3,000 people you've got to keep happy. But people often forget that you may have 300,000 viewers that you've got to try and keep happy on the broadcast. So there's a balance between the two.
We did for the kickoff concert in 2010 at Orlando Stadium. We had 2 control rooms for the 2 different stages. We ran the local broadcasters' Lawu consoles as a distribution truck, and we fed 27 OV vans with our feed. They all had their own audio guys there doing vox pops and running around. We actually had the Icasa truck right next to us, and they were controlling frequencies like crazy. But when it came to the actual show, our feed, our left and right from the 2 different stages, was going to 3.5 billion people. So we have a little bit of say in terms of what happens technically with the split and all that kind of stuff. Just a little bit. And even the control room from the company control room from the States, who was in charge of the production, they were concerned with us, and they came and checked in on us the whole time, and we worked very closely with the entire production team on delivering a product. To the point where we had Shakira, we had Black Eyed Peas, we had what's his name? Piano dude. I almost said John Lennon. John Legend, and all these different guys, and they had their managers that would come and listen and all that. And they weren't in the stadium. They came to us to listen to what the product sounds like, And it's a lot of work. We had a lot of rehearsals. But it is a collaborative effort. And I think in a short way that answers Njabulo's question, where
I just want to get back to his question as well on a different note, and that is this ALC thing again. We've done a few broadcasts where the broadcaster insisted that the ALC remain in place, especially in the early days where they were nervous about this whole loudness compliance thing. And then you're left with trying to mix against that seesaw effect that I described earlier. And the only remedy you have for that really is to mix with a very narrow LRA. In other words, try and create some shades in your mix without really allowing the mix to move much, because the moment the mix moves much, the ALC is going to get a hold of it. And if we understand the sort of parameters that the ALC is set up in, we know how much we can move within a time frame. So at the very least, what we managed to do in some of those cases, allow them to widen the window within which that ALC reacts. So instead of it being 1, 2, or 3 seconds, we can get 5, 6, or 7. but it does limit you in terms of just how loud or how quiet you can go, because the moment you go loud or quiet, the ALC does the opposite. The big problem with these things are they are so good at it that it sounds intentional. So somebody will listen to it and it doesn't sound like something's interfered. It just sounds like that's what the broadcast sounds like.
Yeah, you're moving faders, essentially.
It's really done subtly enough for the listener to blame the mix engineer for the results that they're hearing, not understanding the chain. And that is a problem. And that's why for especially big live events, we try and insist on ALCs being taken out of the chain, and at the very least then quality assurance being put in place where make sure that all the people, especially on your audio side, that is involved in the mix understand loudness and can deliver a final loudness level over a lengthy broadcast.
Yeah. I think your dog has spotted the leopard in the bush.
There's definitely something up around here. I've got several dogs, so that's a few of them going at the moment.
So in a nutshell, just to you know, as an engineer, I mean, obviously we're flawless. We never make mistakes. Yeah, that's an April Fool's joke.
Never.
No, look, I've made mistakes. We've all done it. If you haven't done it, you're lying to yourself more than anybody else. But we learn from our mistakes, and we take the experiences that we've learned over the years to make sure that we get. I remember doing a broadcast, and I was actually up in Africa, but it was being broadcast onto. It was a sports event, but it was a corporate event on a sports channel. So they put it on the sports channel because they had to do with soccer. I'm not naming names. And then before I left South Africa, I actually got in contact with Keith Davies and asked him what's the procedure to take off the ALC, because I know on all the sports channels the ALCs are in because they're expecting all the fluctuations.
Yes.
And then when I landed on that side, I spoke to the executive producer, and then the next day I heard, okay, we're not going to be on SuperSport anymore. It's just going to go to the local region. So I left it. We never asked permission for the ALC to come off. AO was up there with me, and I went ahead and I run my isotopes and I run my leveling, and I actually ended up doing the entire mix out of the SuperSport band. So I was doing music, stems. It's a small booth, so I was running grams. I was doing everything myself, which is a lot of fingers and a lot of hands full. 2.5 hour live show, speeches, music, clapping, crowd, fake crowd on a fader, because one of those crowds. And I ended at neg 22.7 on my side, on my readings. And then I PVR'd it because we found out 2 hours before the show they are going to go to SuperSport. So I thought, okay, well, anyway, it was too late now. So I just knew ALC in mind. Let me do my thing. Came home, have a listen, and I did the same thing that you did. I had a recording of my sent feed, and I came this side, and I'm thinking, these two are very, very close together. And we did some, and I actually spoke to Keith, and they went and looked on the logs, and the engineer recognized me being the engineer on the other side and disabled the ALC.
But, brilliant. Well done.
But didn't tell me. Now imagine if I thought, oh, well, there's an ALC, let me just do my thing. I could have, been in big trouble.
Overcooked it badly.
Exactly. But I stuck to my guns, and I delivered a neg 22.7 over 2.5 hours. And when I got home, I was very pleased with how the music sounded against how the talking sounded of my card. And it's like, that's what I did. That's pretty accurate what I expected. So you do build.
I just want to make a note there in terms of hitting a neg 22.7, right about your 23. If you work with calibrated speakers, in other words, at a set volume, a very, very important. If there's one piece of advice every lecture I ever do, especially to youngsters, I say the first thing you need to do in this game is don't touch that dial.
I made a huge fuss about it on Monday.
Cool. Dial in the volume, stick to it. But the calibration is the next thing. And we can go into some detail on that if you wish. But you need to pick a volume, and it needs to be a fair constant for you at least. There are actually industry standards that you can stick to. I don't advise for youngsters to start off there, but if you're going to have a long career, I do advise you go in that direction, especially if you're wanting to go cinema. Cinema, we work with very strict calibrations. For television, not so much, but you have to have a calibration of some sort that is fixed for you. And you're going to be quite surprised over the years. Even Dolby did research on that, and it all sort of evens out. For most people, if you talk about a bell curve, they fall in a category that puts them on a mark. If you just calibrate to what works for you, if I come down later and do an actual SPL reading, you're going to find that you sit somewhere on that curve, and more than likely in the dead spot average. For a small room, that happens to be minus 79 dB SPL of pink noise. Cinemas, the levels go all the way up to 85, and for some smaller rooms, we can go as low as 76. But once you've got that calibrated level and you mix to that and you get used to that, you'll get to a place where you'll hit neg 23 without looking at a meter.
Yeah.
If you're not that well calibrated yet, a little trick that I teach people, and here's a note for you, is do a mix without looking at the meter. Get your reading. If your reading is neg 21, you were mixing too loud. Turn up your volume by 2 dBs, 2 dB SPL, and you will mix your next show very close to 23. If your mix came out at a 24 or a 25, you were mixing too quiet. In other words, your room was too loud. So it's counterintuitive. Your level is low. Turn your volume in your room down, and you will instinctively mix louder by the increment that you have measured. Ideally, don't do that off one show. Mix about 2 or 3 to get an average, and you'll see, on average, I'm about 2 dBs, which is the equivalent of 2 LU low, and you can make that adjustment. If you are low, turn your volume down, and you will automatically mix louder, and the opposite.
Yeah, so
if you get to that place.
Yeah, I found with myself, I'm mixing at about, and you've been in the OB when I was there, I'm probably about 2 or 3 dBs too loud for what you want to be.
Indeed. But it works for you.
But it works for me because of the hot mic. I've got a technical director screaming it on this side. I've got a comms mic on that side. And I've got people that come in and can talk to me. So I want to make sure that this is not, I take it out of my field of listening, but I want to be just above that. So when I'm doing virtual sound checks, I often actually put the dim button in and I drop it right down. I work at a lower level.
Save your ears a little.
Save my ears. And then, but when the show's running, if I'm just mixing in my studio at the office, I'm sitting at about 82. I'm sitting 81, 82. But it's contextual. What I found is when I do my sound checks, I also end up being a little bit too loud, but everything else is quiet. So I'm getting my ears used to that, so that when I introduce something else, I don't all of a sudden want to push. So
the key is for you, it's 82 every time you do it. That's the point.
Yeah.
And that's why I say for most people, it's not really about that 79 or 81 or 85. It's
consistency.
Except if you're mixing for cinema. If you're going to mix for cinema, there are very strict rules. And if you don't stick by them, your mixes aren't going to translate, because it's a controlled environment end to end.
Yeah.
For most of what we do in music and broadcast, it's not. You're going into people's living rooms, and there are no two that look the same. You need to find something that works for you. The only reason I'm suggesting calibration fixed to standards is if you have aspirations of moving into the film side of things. Other than that, is find out what that number is for you. Even if it is 82 and not 79 in a small room, doesn't matter. It just means if you find yourself in a different small room, you can very, very quickly use an SPL meter and calibrate that room to 82, and you'll know this is what I'm listening at.
Correct.
Or if you don't have an SPL meter or anything like that, play content that you're familiar with.
There we go.
Run with a CD or a MP3 player or something that's got a track or something that you're very familiar with along with you, so that you can play that through the system and adjust the volume, and you'll be surprised just how accurate you can be with that, because you get used to it.
Great. You know this as well. Okay, I think we've done quite a bit tonight. We just about reached an hour, too. Um, it's been a very
On the
interesting
verge
chat.
of two. Wow.
I think a next chat that we can have definitely would be more content based, in terms of managing content and loudness and still getting quality within the restrictions and the limitations and the challenges that we face.
Very good idea.
So, yeah, I'm just going back to this picture now. So, I think if you guys have got questions, we'll share. If Tinus, if you don't mind, if you wouldn't mind us sharing your email address if people have got specific questions, it's up to you.
Sure.
And then we've put those links in the page as well. So have a look at. There's some really good reading material there. But it's all about applying it and understanding it as well. So ask questions. It's very important that when you do get into this field, that you have a technical understanding, a creative understanding, and you've got to be contextual. Because you can do all of this just on visuals. You can switch off your speakers and mix on visual, and you think you're delivering on par, but it sounds like a dog's breakfast. So, we still want to be creative. We still want to do good mixes. We still want to deliver something that the clients are happy with. But we have to then, obviously, the more we understand the technology and the expectations, the better we can deliver. And I think that's the key. Other than that, I think we're going to say goodnight. Any closing comments from you, Tinus?
No, this was a wonderful privilege. Thank you very much for the invite. I know we babbled a lot. I hope there's some value derived from all of this.
There's nothing as nice as a bubble bath.
If we do tackle any of the future stuff, if people have any suggestions or comments or specific questions that they may want us to address, I'm even happy to prepare. In this particular one, I figured having a chat would be better, not to do a death by PowerPoint kind of presentation. But if there is stuff that they'd like explained in a bit more technical detail, I can prepare something along those lines. Sometimes seeing some of that on screen helps a lot. I think one of the things we didn't get around to tonight, which I thought we may, was the sort of setups and stuff.
The lineups and all those kind of stuff.
While we did the lineup stuff, we spoke through that. I'm talking about setting up the actual venue and things like that, the routings and stuff like that. I don't know if you guys have covered that before.
I've done some of that already. We've sort of touched on that in Lego pieces. On some of our other things, when I speak about front of house, when I spoke about broadcast, or we spoke about systems with Adrian, and even in those, I think on episode 2 or 3, I brought up some of our planning documents where we even incorporated EVS assignments within the vans and everything in terms of capturing. So and I've used the voice often as a template because it's got so many varieties in terms of content from a planning perspective. So that helps a lot. And it's anything in context makes a lot more sense than just out on its own. So if you've got a scenario or something you've noticed, more than welcome to ask a question. And I think other than that, we're going to say goodnight. You've got our email address. Like our page, you'll see when we go live again. Like I said, tomorrow night we're chatting to Marius Marais. That's going to be quite interesting. Just going to have another bubble. It's going to be nice. And then just look out for our next streams. There's been a question to do a workflow like I did on Monday, specifically for front of house only on consoles, which I'll do. And then I'm going to maybe bring Simon in to do something like that for monitoring control as well, and monitor workflows and monitor consoles. And then what I can do is I can bring in Paul Smith or someone like that for broadcast console setups and those kind of workflows. I know he's listening to this, so he's probably just jumped out of his seat. But yeah, so there's lots of things coming, and I think if you've got any suggestions, just keep them coming, and we'll try and accommodate. But we're doing this because we love what we do, and it's fun. So thank you for joining us, and thank you, Tinus. Appreciate it. Appreciate the time. I don't know if you look cold, so you can go in and get warm, or get a coffee, and we'll chat soon.
Don't know if you can see, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit cool there. I can see you in a jacket. Okay, thanks,
Indeed.
guys. Cool.
Excellent. Righty.